Morning. Oh, loud me this morning. So I am Rachel Appel, and I work for JetBrains. They make some software tools and things like that. And I'm going to talk about things that every JavaScript developer should know for the next 45 minutes. Now, you could go on for far longer than 45, 50 minutes about things that JavaScript developers should know, especially if I get all ranty, right? And I start off on a tangent. But I'm going to hit some of the things that just come up frequently in JavaScript land. And it's been changing quite a bit in the last few years. Finally, people started taking it kind of seriously, since it is basically powering the whole internet now, right? Everything. You can't escape it. You can't escape it now. And I come from a web background. I did a lot of server-side stuff, and especially ASP.NET. And I worked at Microsoft on that team for a while. And you still get sucked over into JavaScript, right? You just can't escape it. So I'm going to talk about some of these things. These things aren't necessarily going to be the most advanced things. Somebody always gets upset. Well, you didn't talk about how bytes are stored on the disk. Like, does everybody actually need to know that? No, you really don't. Right? When's the last time you had to go debug something at the assembly level? Right? If you're that old. Oh yeah, I see canes in the back, walkers in the back of the room. A couple of old people, like myself. But, somebody will have to do that. But everybody surely isn't going to do that. So many of these things will apply to you. Some of them may not, but it's still nice to know, and they're things that just commonly come up. Or things that are kind of good to know. So even though I said things that every JavaScript developer should know, it's good to know, but everybody's different. Not 100% of everything will apply to you. Some things will be basic, some will be a little more advanced. It just really depends on what you're doing, because we're not all building the same application. Right? We're doing lots of different things. So with that, we'll get started. And what I'll do is I'll just hang on to questions until the end, because unless you are the loudest person in the room, and actually I am because I have the microphone, I can't hear too well sometimes, so I'll just have you come up afterward. So the first thing that we could learn from JavaScript, this still actually comes up. And this is the most basic thing of all, like literally, what is JavaScript versus Java? We're early in 2019 right now. But even last year, I'm at a conference and an attendee comes up and they're talking blah, blah, blah Java, blah, blah, blah JavaScript. Me. Do you know they're not the same? What? They're not. This person was kind of surprised. I'm like, not the same. Java's not a nickname for JavaScript. But this, in my opinion, is like one of the world's greatest marketing schemes ever, right? They named it JavaScript on purpose, and it was for that reason. To confuse people into thinking it was like Java. Except people didn't think it was like Java. They started thinking it is Java. And I'm like, well, here's the difference. So that is the most basic thing you have to get over if you're going to be working in JavaScript. And if you have been, especially if you've worked in Java and JavaScript, then you certainly know they can be very different. Here's another classic favorite, right? Traditionally, JavaScript has been the bane of many people's existence, right? Because the language was written in a short amount of time, just a few weeks, and its purpose was not anywhere near what we're using it for today. Boy, have we developers gone and ruined this one. Right? We said it's supposed to just work with this tiny little DOM right? A little document object model for this internet thing that'll never take off, right? That internet thing. And the DOM back then, we had what, maybe like 6 HTML tags. One of them scrolled across the page and the other was a blink. They're not even around anymore. That's what this was written for, right? That. And as the web started evolving and taking off and taking over our lives, JavaScript was like, nah, I'm good. I'll just hang out here and do nothing and not evolve for a while. And then developers were like, oh, this is crap. And then some guy, Douglas Crockford, went and wrote a book and he said, I've had enough of this. So I'm going to write a book about the good parts of JavaScript. Tiny little book, which is a nice, hilarious meme now on the internet. So how very meta. So a little bit of that history there. So JavaScript had a very precise purpose and maybe in many circles was not even that serious of a thing in the early days. But now it kind of is, right? Many of us are making entire livings off of JavaScript, and it's powering every website on the internet has JavaScript just about. We throw those little no script tags in pages and go, yeah, sure. Right? For like those 2 people who will not get rid of the Commodore 64 and they try to browse the web with it. That sort of thing. But it's here and it's staying. So we'll start out with the one thing that JavaScript is really known for, or known not for. So data types. So as a programmer, we're used to working with data, of course, whether it comes from a database, input from a user, whatever. It doesn't matter the source. And it's all typed. So we know if we're dealing with a number, if we're dealing with textual data, dates, whatever, right? So we have these types. And JavaScript is like, oh yeah, you have those. I don't care. That's kind of how JavaScript has approached this. There are data types in JavaScript. A few primitives like number, string, boolean, null, a few of those. But JavaScript generally would say, okay, so you have a type. I'm not going to make you say what the type is, and I don't give a crap what you put in there or what you do with it. Or if you try to add a duck to 25, I'll run with it. So that's JavaScript. And then a lot of developers, myself included, that comes from more of a comp sci background, you're like, what is this sorcery? Like, why would a language let you do this? And it does. But of course, it's that history from it working with those parts of the DOM. You didn't really need that. It was mostly just string data. So it's really loose. It's not statically typed. It's also a parsed language, not compiled. Anymore, we started putting the hammer on that one, right? We were making it compile or transpile if you're using something like Typescript. So there are data types. It's just that generally JavaScript don't care. All right, so we have to make it care by being diligent programmers. I know, that is hilarious. It's early for that one, isn't it? So if you've worked with other programmers, it's always the other programmers, right? And you've seen the crappy code that they write. If you've seen the code that I write, you will know that a lot of programmers seem to care less than JavaScript about some of this. Even the ones that do care and are very diligent, you're not perfect, right? So you may make mistakes. And then we do have a duck trying to multiply 20 by itself. And it just, JavaScript's like, whatever, duck 20, we're good. So data types, we have ways of dealing with that. One way is if we go to something like Typescript or modern JavaScript, like even ES5, ES6, or using some tools like Babel or some other frameworks to help us manage this. If you go over to C#, Java, even VB, for crying out loud. It forces you to work with types in a very distinct way. But JavaScript's like, nah, like we'll just do whatever. So, there are some special values, like infinity, my favorite, negative infinity, because JavaScript. Nan is a favorite of everybody's too. Also null. If you come from database land, null has a specific thing that it means. And in JavaScript, it means it's not a reference, or it's a reference to a non-existing object. It's not a pointer. It's just a special value. It means, I don't know. That's what it means. All right, so there's some piece of storage there, some variable. But if it's null, we just don't know what's in it. It's unknown. But a lot of people will end up doing things like trying to compare a variable to null with quotes around it. Well, that's not null. That's a string, right? Once you put the ticks around it. So things like that. That happens in the database land too. So if anybody's worked as a DBA, you've had the fun of people actually putting the letters N-U-L-L in a column and going, it's null. No, it's a string. It's a string. We're good. So data types. So we do have them. And what we could do with data types is a lot of fun and interesting things. But when it comes down to it, everything is stored with like a key value pair under the hood. It just goes, yeah, I got to store stuff. You give this thing a name, it's variable, or a function, or an object, or whatever. Anything that has a name, and even stuff that doesn't have a name, has to be stored somewhere, right? And in some languages, we use a pointer. Some languages, like an actual pointer. Some languages, we just might use a reference or whatever. But in JavaScript, we just crank up a little variable, and JavaScript does all the storage for us, which is nice that it does that. And then it ends up being this. So as a data type, even a function is kind of treated as a data type. But it's not just a data type. It's a thing with a name, but sometimes not a name. But if it has a name, you could call it by that name. If it doesn't have a name, it's just a block of code that could run. But it's still considered a type under the hood. So if we take a look here, see I have WebStorm. And I should have something about types here. So, for regular types, you can do things like a classic var, or now, being that, can everybody see in the back? Do I need to up the font a little bit? Let's go find the fonts here. Let's do 20. A little bit better? Good? Okay. So that's like the first thing I do is make the font bigger. Cannot really make it big enough, I think, sometimes. And I guess this makes me hipster now, but I don't like the dark theme either. I can't see anything. I have thick glasses. That's, I guess, for the kids. I'm too old for that. Get off my lawn. So here. So now you could use in later JavaScript. We used to just do var, right? So to do a variable. And then JavaScript would allocate that and let you use it. But in some of the later versions of ECMAScript, which is with the standards that JavaScript is based off of, they said, well, we have these new ways of allocating that resource. One is called let and one is const. So the const is similar to a constant. You're going to take that variable and it's just going to be immutable, and you're going to just use it that way. So we could change over to a let, or you could still use a var. Or in JavaScript, you actually don't have to do anything. I could just do something like this. And that's legal, right? So it'll come across this line, and it'll see this my str, and it'll put the value of hey what in there, and it'll happily roll along. Now, any other language would get all sorts of upset, and it would compile error. How dare you not properly declare this like a real programmer? I believe that's the actual error in C#, right? It says something like that. But JavaScript's just like, oh, you want to do a thing, use this, and you want to call it that? Sure, we'll do that. I don't care if you did it the right way or not. We're just going to roll with it. Yeah, JavaScript is really loose about stuff. So that would be perfectly fine. You shouldn't do that, but JavaScript will let you. Unless you're using a tool like a linter, or if you're using a product like WebStorm that runs linters and has checking for making sure you're programming it in a proper manner. So that sort of thing, right? So we don't technically want to do that. So we could just declare our variables this way with a let, a var, or a const. If you have a lot of classic JavaScript, you'll see a lot of vars. That's perfectly fine. In here, WebStorm's nice. It'll let you, it'll say, oh, look, you could use let or const. Thank you. Okay, I'll do that. So I have that. So these just work as you might expect, right? So I could do for stuff like a string, single quote, double quote. Newer versions of JavaScript, modern JavaScript, has what's called string interpolation. So if you use backticks, not the single quote, but a backtick, you can actually finally have a language feature that some of the other languages have had, and that you could use a little placeholder with a $, curly brackets, your variable, and then another ending bracket, and that will just replace that token. So it'll let you do that as well, which is really nice. As far as other types, working with these types, you could use type of to get the type, which shows some interesting results sometimes, especially later when we talk about comparing them. So here, I could check and see things like, well, what type is undefined, and what type is this, or what type is 123. And here I'm using it with just logging to the console and doing a little string replacement, string interpolation, and checking out the types. So if I go and I look at this, we just run this in the browser really quick. And since I'm logging, I'll bring up my dev tools. And which one? Oh yeah. So now modern browsers are going to find stuff like this in YL because I have, where is it in here? One of these, yeah, this one. It's not going to like stuff like that. But here, if I do my show type of, and type of many types. So if I run that, you could see all of these. Right, so it tells you like, oh, this is my favorite. What is nan? What's the type of nan? Which nan stands for not a number. What's the type of? No, it's a number. Like, what? It's too early for this. It's not even past lunch. But if I look at things like function, right? So it picks it out like, hey, that's a type. It's a function type. Right? So it actually does have types. It's just that it doesn't care that you care or not about them. We need tools to help us with that. Linters and editors and compilers and stuff like that. So, and when I say compilers, we might take JavaScript and run it through something like Babel, which compiles JavaScript to JavaScript. Just make sure that you do it the correct way. Or something like Typescript, which is a superset of JavaScript, and then it just compiles it to JavaScript in that very purest form that you should do if you were just about the perfect programmer. You go and you look at the code in there, and it really does some serious patterns and making sure it declares everything, and everything is perfectly in order. So here you can see all the standard stuff here. Objects, null's an object, even alert. It notices that that's a function, right? And tells me what that type is. So you can use types, and you could cast to types and all of that. So nan, we just saw nan. So because nan doesn't actually know what it is, it says it's not a number, but then you ask it the type of and it says number. So I think it's full of it. So things that you can't do, if you do like some variable equals nan with the double equals, which I'll talk about those in the double and triple in a minute. If you do that, it doesn't work. But then if you do it the way that's the supposed proper way to do equality, that doesn't work either. So what are you supposed to do with this thing? Mostly when you're starting out, people start writing code and then nan starts showing up everywhere and they're like, what is this thing chasing me around? I can't do equality on it. I can't. What do I do? So what we want to do is use type of and check to see if something is a type of number. Right? Oh yeah, type of, we got that. So nan isn't really meant for this equality stuff, clearly. But we could use type of instead. Nan is just a value that comes back to you to tell you just how wrong you are about everything. Not the only thing that does in JavaScript, but it does. So we have that. If you want to check out what a number is, you could also do an is number. I think ES6 brought out is numbers. So functions. Functions are objects, right? So if you do the type of, it'll show up as a function, right? And it's a callable object. Generally, there's two kind of large categories of functions. One's a function expression, and one's a statement. The statement is your classic function. So if you come from any programming language and you come over and you look and you see something like this, function do stuff, that's a function statement. It's got the function keyword in there, name of the function, parentheses, maybe some arguments in there, brackets, and your code, right? That's pretty standard. But then we have these function expressions, which in JavaScript, you can actually do something like set up a variable, or in this case, WebStorm's like, hey, what about that let? Or let or const or whatever. And I could set up some variable and say it equals the function. So in many languages, I think there's a few that do let you do this, but a lot of them, you have to set up your function. It allocates the resources where they need to go, and then you could call it later, which is kind of like what you do here, right, with your do stuff. And I do that here. So once I click a button, then I could just, very traditional right here, just calling do stuff, it returns something. I got that value, I could use that value. An expression, you could just kind of whip it up right there. And I have a variable and then my function block. As the parser gets to it, it says, oh yes, function expression. So what I will do is just parse and evaluate and run this, or parse and evaluate this right now. And it might run it depending on how you structure it. If you, do I have one in here? Oh, I thought maybe, okay, maybe not. If you pull what a popular tool, Jquery, does, you can use a little pattern to encapsulate this and make what's called an IFE or an IIFE, and that's immediately invoked function expression. So I could take it, wrap it in parentheses, something like this, and then say, whoop, little extra parentheses right there. And the editor's yelling about something I did that was horrible, I'm sure. And when you do that, as the parser gets to it, it will take a look at it, check it, allocate the memory and stuff like that, and then run it right away. So you have this choice as to how you want to work with expressions and statements. So in general, if you just want more of a classic way of doing things, you can go with a statement, right? And just run that. Otherwise, you can do an expression. And you see this expression quite a bit in some tools and libraries out there, frameworks that you download to be able to do that. Also things that it tends to think are function, well, they kind of are, right? Because it's a bit of an object. I could do something very similar to this. In here, I'm just grabbing an array and looping over it. But I can actually create like a property. I could say, core elements, or I could say like customer, and then put my curly brackets and first name, last name, address, and then it will treat that as a function /object. So I could do things like that as well. So you have a lot of flexibility in the syntax. And unless you have a specific thing you want to do or a specific way to allocate, they're not necessarily any of them wrong or one that you should always use or never use. Like, they're all perfectly fine to use given the situation. A couple things to know. Your classic statement. There's a little process called, oh, no semicolon there. There we go. That's better. There's a little thing called hoisting. So when JavaScript, a JavaScript parser or interpreter, so IE or Firefox or whatever browser or host is going to run JavaScript, that parser it'll start going through the script and running top down. When it gets to a function statement, it says, oh, yes, a classically declared block of code. What I'm going to do is make sure that this is available, so it hoists it and puts it up at the top of the space. So then what I could do is declare stuff like this, but actually I could move these around kind of like this. So even though I'm calling do stuff here before it's declared, that's okay. So some languages won't let you do that, right? You have to declare the block of code first, then you can use it. A lot of them do that with variables as well, but variables also get hoisted in JavaScript. So if you do a classic statement, you're fine. If you do an expression, though, it's in line. So if I do an expression and I'm calling it, I'm meant to kind of call it right here, right? Or right where I'm at. So it gets evaluated at that time. So that's another little thing to know about functions. Another thing too is we have a newer construct in some modern JavaScript, which is arrow functions, and they create what's called closures. So another thing functions do, depending on how you're working with them, I'll talk about this in a bit, but there's this keyword this concept called this, which is also a giant pain in the rear end, because nobody knows what this is. It just depends on what you're doing, and you just don't know. So arrows behave, if you do the little arrow function, so you might see the little equal sign and an arrow. It's a newer construct to give us a more concise syntax. So what they do is they don't create their own value for that. They just use whatever this is for the enclosing block. So I may have this in here somewhere. Do I? I do for a different one. So I'll show you that in a minute. It's not the exact same thing. So we can create objects in two ways. Classic JavaScript, you might do something like this, which is what I just mentioned before. You can actually set this up in a function. So you can do like function, product, and maybe even pass in a name and a price, kind of as a constructor, if you will. And then here we have this keyword this. And this is going to just be kind of scoped to this little block of code. So they had to call it this. Like, they couldn't use some actual easier to distinguish keyword that is not just a regular word that comes up in sentences every 10 seconds. So here we have our function called product. Somebody calls this, like down at the bottom here, a variable or a let or whatever, and they use a new keyword. You can actually just pass in some of that data. And although it's a function, you get this cool little dot notation object you could work with. So that's one way you could set up an object. And you could actually do object-oriented programming in JavaScript. The syntax can get a little weird unless you do it this way. Another thing you could do too is define properties with an actual object.define property. See, I'm doing it the easy, nice, shortcut way here. But some folks actually do a define property. And there's another one that's not even on the slide because I hate it. But you'll come across it, and that's the prototype. It's just ugly. And I don't like, there's something to be said about ugly code. if you're looking at code and it hurts your eyes, literally physically hurts your eyes to look at it, it's probably not good code, right? No matter how well intentioned it was. And that word prototype like hurts my eyes. So like I have a physical reaction to it. Yeah, it gets the job done, but it's kind of annoying. So especially when we have all these object-oriented languages that use much better constructs. So we can actually use functions just to whip up an object with properties. Now, in the later ECMAScript, if you don't want to do it the classic way, yeah, that's cool. You can actually just use a class keyword and getters and setters. Right? So if you come from C#, you're probably going to go right there. That's cool. That works. Right? It does all the proper structuring of memory and everything and all that. So we're good. So it just depends. If you have legacy code, you'll definitely see stuff like this in there. So speaking of object-oriented JavaScript, which is not even close to what the creators thought would happen with this language. Let's build a little language to work with these web pages. Well, what are you doing with this? Building an enterprise system that is object-oriented. Here we are, 2019. So you can, and if you do inheritance, we have multiple ways to do it now. All right, so in modern JavaScript, you can do your class keyword, and you could do an extends, like a normal language does, right? And then if you go the classic way, you get that prototype-based inheritance, which just for the longest time, working in C# and Java, and even VB.NET for crying out loud, you get proper constructs to do inheritance and all of that good stuff. But then JavaScript's like, nah, prototype. Yeah, so you can do that, but now we have classes and extends. So that's really nice that we can do. But still, even though these are objects, they're often going to be objects/functions. And as far as JavaScript under the hood's concerned, it's just all a big dictionary anyway. So with our objects that we're creating, or even just plain little variables here and there, this is a very basic one. Usually you run into this quickly. And there's a lot of tools out there to make people stop having to deal with this. What's called global namespace pollution. So if we just start writing script, and I have a lot of it like it in here because these are just samples, right? They're tiny little things. Like here, if I go to dates, like all of this stuff. Look at this. I don't even have like vars or lets in here. And JavaScript does not care. It's just like, okay, I'll make a new date. I'll make a new date. I'll make another one. And it's just loading up stuff all over the place. It'll just keep going. Any other compiler would be like, you're insane. Stop this. Right, not JavaScript. But all of this, oh, I did put it in a function. Let's pretend that that's not there. Okay, so that's not there now, right? Okay, so because this is not here anymore, I commented that all of this, JavaScript's like, yeah, have a date, have this. And then it goes, oh, I have to put these somewhere, right? Where? You didn't say where. It's not in a function anymore. You took this out, right? So I would have put them under this due date, but you commented that out. So where do I put them? It just puts it in what's called the global namespace, which is the window object. So if you go into any browser and you start poking around in the dev tools, you'll see that top level object, that window object. It just shoves them in there. Now, for like a demo and a talk, that's perfectly fine. In an actual system, probably not, because what I'm doing here, I have this little dates.html, dates.js. That's the only JavaScript page this little JavaScript file, this little HTML page is going to use. In a real system, you're probably going to have stuff like this. You'll have a page that references a script. And I just called them 1, 2, and 3 here. But then that page will not just reference a script, but another script and another. So you may have 10 script references in there. Or if you're working with modules and loaders and things like that, You might be importing scripts and using some other resources to help manage so you don't have a whole bunch of script tags there. That might also be happening as well. So when JavaScript sees all of these scripts, it's like, oh, come on in, come on in. Oh, you have all these variables. Where do I put them? Right. Well, if there's a variable in that first one, like variables A, B, or C in the first script, but somebody also declared variables A, B, and C in the second one, JavaScript's going to be like, I see. These things are all the same name, and they're all in the same space. That must mean clearly you want to overwrite it, and you do not want a warning either. We're just going to do it. Because warnings are for losers. We don't do that in JavaScript. So this has caused a lot of grief for people because it just happily overwrites it. It goes, that must be what you wanted, right? And then that just, no, it's not at all. So what happens, for example, if I just have a simple page with a few scripts, perhaps here, I have a, like, who is this? I know a bunch of other Rachels that are developers. It's really weird. It's kind of like Scots. There's an awful lot of Scots that are developers. They're all at Microsoft too. Right? It's like really weird. So there's Rachels too. But here I have this variable called who is it? Right? If it goes, it logs. And then look at, even if I do this again, in the same space, another compiler would be like, oh, excuse me. Maybe you didn't want to do this. JavaScript's like, of course you did. All right? So, or even if I take that out, right? So it's just going to Now, a regular language would just overwrite it if I took out the variable. But now, if I even go into a little space where I'm adding an event listener, it'll log it. But since I imported all three of those, even here, if I even have a var, or if I don't, it doesn't matter. Well, if I didn't, that's not really the issue. But even if I have a variable set up with a var here, right, it's just going to override that and override, right? So that could get kind of annoying quickly, right, because you probably didn't intend that. If you are intending it to do that, either brilliant or you hate your coworkers. I just don't know how to play that one. Or it could be both. Right? So you want to watch that stuff. That's easy to get people. So, of course, you could create your own namespaces. It's not a for real namespace, but whenever you create a function, if you do like a function statement, it will block off that little bit of space, and it knows that particular item or variable belongs there. Now, it depends on exactly how you declare it and things like that. But you'll hear throughout this talk, I use the word Typescript a lot. So, and it wasn't just because I had worked for Microsoft at some point, right? I actually like this language because one of the primary reasons it was built, well, the whole type thing, it's called Typescript. Right? So it helps you manage types in JavaScript properly. And they said, well, not just types. This is the guy who worked on C# language going over to TypeScript. So he's bringing a lot of those classic programming elements into the language. So things like managing scope and how variables behave in their lifetime, and making it so you don't have to, every time you write a single line of code, that you don't have to sit there for 25 minutes going, will this be in the global space? Does this go in my function? Does this go under a block? Because JavaScript doesn't necessarily have block scope either. So if you put stuff in an if statement, it could actually be overwritten later. Things like that, which are, just to keep track of all of that in your head is quite frankly unnecessary for a programmer. Now, as an academic exercise, it's fantastic. But when you have a boss breathing down your neck and you're trying to get it done, not so good. All right, so that's one thing. Another thing that JavaScript tries to help with are the semicolons, and you saw one, I forgot one there. Automatic semicolon insertion. You don't put the semicolon in, it will. And then you get stuff like this. Oh, shit. Right? So if you actually put the word return and then the return value on the next line and then the statement cap, it'll just return, but it won't return anything. It stops the party. If you do it, so this is how the parser sees it, because it adds this in for you. Oh, how convenient that I did not want that. Right, so that's something to... By now, a lot of editors help. And they tell you, oh, you forgot that. But once in a while, they don't. Or, you know, I know you're in here. Notepad person. There's one in every room, right? You're likely to miss these, right? Because Notepad does not tell you about that. So, Notepad person. So what we have in JavaScript with these little things is block syntax, but you don't necessarily get block scope. So if you have an if, variables can escape and run wild. Like that should be JavaScript's like tagline. It runs wild. That's basically it. So variables created in blocks are available for the function. And this is another good reason why we have things like arrow functions and closures and stuff like that. So closure is a function. It's an anonymous function. So it means we just didn't give it a name. I don't need to call it anything. I just want to make a little block here, and I want to trap the variables in here where they belong, because other compiler would tell me and make me do that. JavaScript won't, so I would do that. So you could do that with a function expression, not a statement generally. So and that can help us create a closure. So that kind of works in tandem with this. And this is kind of actually best shown with, believe it or not, Jquery, because it makes a perfect closure for this. So yeah, look, this is Jquery code. Yep. I know, we're old school now. Jquery. Here's the part of my HTML. It is just a page with an unordered list. And in this list, I have, you know, a few items, A, B, C, and D. And outside of this list, I just have a couple of divs, a button, a few spans, a paragraph. So nothing fancy in here. Then I have my Jquery code and my script. So what I do is when the button is clicked, I'm doing this classic little pattern. You would see it with the word self very often. So I'm trapping this in a variable, and then I'm calling it that. So unique and genuine that was. And then I'm just taking the text of that little span, and I'm saying, well, what is that? And I'm getting the ID from it. So that would be one of these items. Or possibly something else, right? Because this, unlike other languages, where you know what this is. There's this in a lot of languages. In VB, it's me. That makes me giggle. I don't know why. But this is usually like the currently executing instance of a class. We're done. That's this. JavaScript is like, nah, we're wild here. This can be whatever I want it to be, but not what you want it to be. I just want me. I'm JavaScript. Then here, if I go through and I do an each through here. So this will give me something. It'll tell me what this is. This has to start somewhere. That sounds like a good tagline for a political campaign. This has to start somewhere. So it should start with a window. Window's going to be this at some point, right? Then as I go through something like a list of items, and I refer to this, and I put it in some other, I ran out of names quickly, just the other, now it's the other. This is going to change. So it could change from element to element. Yeah, it's like that. Okay. So when I click this, it should go through and it'll turn stuff red as it becomes this and say what this is, right? So it did, it found out, oh, that's right, I forgot about this one. The button, because I clicked it, becomes this. See how easy it, like I've done this demo like 1,000 times and I totally forgot about the button becoming this. So if I can forget, it's really easy to forget this. After I click the button, in the loop, right, it goes through and it loops and turns the ones red as they become this. So this changes like constantly. Now, some of your modern languages like Typescript help capture this and wrangle this in, right? Like a good little construct. So you just want to be aware of that. Arrays. Arrays also let you do whatever you want. Let's take a quick look here at arrays. Because look at something like this. So I have an array with 1 through 9. So if I did a length, it's going to say, well, you got 9 things in there. Okay, we're good. But then I do that. What the hell? JavaScript. Now, any reasonable language would be like, excuse me, you're not doing that. That's called an out of bounds exception. But JavaScript does not know bounds. And it's just like, you want it, you got it. Right? The tagline should be, we have the rope. Please go hang yourself. Right? It's JavaScript in a nutshell. Right? So this, and I do a length, and it'll actually be like, yeah, that's cool. 13, we're good. So literally nothing in here, just to run the code. So console, I guess. But yeah, it'll do that. So did I even hook that up or no? What the hell did I do there? Oh, I guess I didn't. Okay, I could just run this in the console. But that's going to tell me that I have now 13 items in there. What? Like I shouldn't. And then it skips over. It just doesn't add one like you should. Now, you can do things like, here I have, I could do pushes and stuff like that. And there is this array object, capital A array. You could use it. However, here's the deal with this. It will work. It will give you like push and all those kind of methods. However, if you are worried about performance, that's going to eat up a lot more resources on you. If it's a tiny array like the stuff in here, probably not a big deal. But if you have to do some serious loops or you're capturing a lot of stuff in arrays, nope, you probably want to stay away from that one. There is no real concept of a multi-dimensional array, but you can do it, sort of, with a jagged array. All right, so I could have a little array inside an array if I do it that way. That's acceptable. That's fine too. All right, so those work. And then if you do this array, you do, of course, get the push and all that good stuff. So I kind of like to say there's not true arrays, because a true array would scream, right? The compiler would scream and be like, out of bounds, you can't do that. So if you do a type of, it'll tell you it's an object. Right? So we're good. And the capital A one is definitely an object. For dates, yeah, all right, this is every language. Dates are ridiculous, right? Trying to work with dates and time zones. So it's just amplified in JavaScript. What I like to do is, the nutshell is go with moment or date.js, one of the two. All right, so those will work for you. I'll finish up here with equality. This is this has more with this, right? So we have these two ways to do equality, which should just be one way, but no, we get two because what language doesn't give you this kind of choice? So we have on the left what's called abstract equality, strict equality on the right. And JavaScript will take those operators that you use, and it will compare the operands on the outside. And if it's the one on the left here, what it'll do is it'll say, oh, you're using abstract, the double equal. So I'm going to be nice and try to help. Oh, please don't leave it help. It's like that helpful auntie, not very helpful. I'm going to help. So it'll try to convert those data types to what it thinks you wanted. No, it's like smoking dope. It has no idea what you wanted. So it'll be wrong. So you just don't. Right? Over here, though, it'll take a look and it'll say, are these actually, that this is the only time it cares about types. Are these actually the same type? Oh, you're not? Okay, then I will not compare. Because that's how a normal language does it. Right? Not JavaScript. And it does it because of these truthy, and here's another, the fact that we have these words, right? Truthy and false, not true and false, truth, sort of, truthy, sort of falsy. Maybe it's true. Who knows? Who knows? It's JavaScript. So things like, what could be truthy? False with what? Right? But that could parse to true because it's truthy. Right? At least stuff like false and zero are absolutely false. At least there's some sense of sanity. But things that, like an empty array or object is truthy. What? Right? And then you could compare it with like null. Like, who does that? People do. And JavaScript does not care. So if I come over here and look at, here we go, truthy, falsy in here. Oh, under equality with an E, right? So I have this little table here. And it has these different expressions, which, what it is, if it's falsy or truthy, and then what the result would be. Now, exactly what this expression is exactly what the script will evaluate. So when I run the abstracts, really, false equals 0. I think you're full of it, JavaScript, quite frankly. Right? Is it? And then null is undefined. Really? Because, right? There's like, what do you say to this? Well, I say use the strict equality. So if I do this, oh yeah, now JavaScript is actually like, okay, I'll step up and do real compilation for now. Look at this. These are not the same. I was just bullshitting you back there with the other one, right? So the moral of the story is use the strict equality because JavaScript will, it just kind of lets everything run loose when you do the abstract equality. The fact that it's even in there. Stuff like Typescript and whatnot will be like, hey, extra equal sign. So it'll kind of remind you generally, or a linter. So, and I think I'm getting the evil eyeball here about going over time. So we have those couple things. And the only other things, like I'll just zip up to, oh, here's something else. Just go look at this. We need this table. It's on GitHub. Yeah, the fact that this is a thing, right? It's time to run out of the room now, right? There's an actual table of equality and that is on GitHub. So you can go find that. But you don't need this if you use the strict. Then you're good, right? I'll just zip up to the end here and just some stuff to know about. I've mentioned TypeScript several times. Go and look at it. This is very, very helpful. Babel's helpful as well. You can write modern JavaScript and it will compile it backwards if you have to support older environments. TypeScript can also validate just JavaScript code that's not even using any of the TypeScript constructs in it. So it's like a light linter. So you have some of those things. Other things that, like JavaScript, again, it lets you do all kind of weird stuff. Like this. I can declare a function with nothing and then pass in numbers and a cat. It doesn't care. Like, you just have to watch literally every piece of code you write until you're in the asylum. So go get a linter. There's like ESLint, ESHint. If you use something like WebStorm, it has linting. It uses those linters. There's other third-party linters. So linter is kind of like not quite a compiler, but it goes through and it checks your code and makes sure you're not doing stuff like this that JavaScript will let you do. Yeah, this is totally legit. And it'll actually accept these. And you could say arguments and then put in square brackets and it will accept those. And so it doesn't just let you pass it in, but you can use those values. Who does that? Oh yeah, JavaScript. So things like that. So get yourself a good linter and something other than Notepad. I know that one person's going to want to cling to Notepad, but it does not help you with JavaScript. But there are plenty of tools that do. So with that, I'll stop talking now. Again with the evil eyeball. So thanks, and I'll just be around if people have more questions or whatever. So.